The King of Naples was more especially under the influence of the young officers who surrounded him. He was himself a man of pleasure and delighted to meet with opinions which encouraged his own wishes. He likewise was desirous of seeing Moscow. Nothing could exceed the illusion of his mind on military matters. He was persuaded, for instance, that the army had never yet had a cavalry officer at all to be compared to himself. He was unquestionably a man of conspicuous bravery, a quality that may supply the place of many others, which cannot nevertheless be well dispensed with when the highest degree of elevation has been attained. He was of a kind and generous disposition, and much beloved by all who approached him. This description ought to be the less suspected, proceeding as it does from one who never had the least intention of renewing an intercourse with him. If I could not refuse my admiration of his impetuous valor, I mistrusted his temerity, which would have been productive of disastrous consequences, had not the emperor been always on his guard against the mad expeditions of a man who was so much in his confidence. It was for the misfortune of France that this prince had been recalled to the army in Poland. The reports and information obtained by the light troops that followed the track of the Russian army always passed through his hands. In his capacity of general-in-chief of the cavalry, the emperor never received them, but through him, the King of Naples represented the moral power of the Russian army as broken down, its physical strength as exhausted, adding that it could only retreat slowly and with great difficulty. He insisted that if hotly pursued for a few days longer, it would be unable to avoid a battle, and a battle was an event quite indispensable to us. The emperor could not avoid paying attention to the representations of a man who spoke every day the same language, and who was known to be unsparing of his person on the field of battle. The Prince of Neuchâtel did not differ in opinion from the King of Naples. Everyone, however, preferred marching upon Moscow rather than returning back to Vilna or Vitebsk, where all felt a dread of passing the winter. These entreaties obtained additional weight with the emperor when he considered that what he had ordered to be done in Poland was scarcely begun, or, to speak more correctly, had not yet been thought of. Dances went on at Vilna, and gambling with all its consequences at Warsaw, and the delay in the execution of his plans was ascribed to the want of confidence evinced by the Polish nation, so long as no battle should have been fought between the contending armies, which might give some stability to the destinies of Poland. It was accordingly determined that the army should march forward and come to action with the Russians, the same motives which had caused the diplomatic body to be summoned to Warsaw in 1806 occasioned its appearance at Vilna in 1812. The Empress herself, whether she was aware of this determination or was desirous of undertaking the journey, allowed the report to circulate about her immediate attendants. The emperor set his army in motion, not so much with the view of marching to Moscow as to offer battle to the Russian army on the earliest opportunity, and previously to the arrival of its divisions from Finland and of the army of Moldavia, which would compel him to adopt a different plan of operations. The most intense feeling when using this prevailed in Paris, however great the confidence which was habitually reposed in the French army. It had never entered into the imagination of anyone that it would attempt to advance so far into the Russian Empire. Loud complaints were made of the total absence of our former influence over foreign cabinets, which was in no instance more evident than in its being at a loss where to fix the lever which was to act upon Sweden, and upon Bernadotte in particular. Why was it said, did we not select a plenipotentiary from our closets? We should then have made sure of the result of the negotiation. All hope had not yet been laid aside, but no surprise would have been felt at the news of any disastrous event when the bulletin was received of the celebrated battle of Moskva, which was fought on the 7th September 1812 at about 25 leagues from Moscow. It would have been a source of much greater satisfaction had the event therein described taken place nearer home. Nothing but the intense interest felt in that event would have had the effect of engrossing the public attention. The artillery of the Invalides fired 100 rounds, and Te Deum was sung in all the churches. Joy was no doubt pictured in every countenance, but it had not dispelled the uneasiness which pervaded all ranks. Tranquillity reigned over all of France and in Italy. In France especially, not the slightest agitation was heard, and all appeared unanimous in their desire to enjoy uninterrupted repose. The emperor was in the habit of writing every day to Paris, and he daily received an estivette with the reports and correspondence of each of his ministers. A few days after the receipt of the bulletin of the Battle of Moscow, intelligence was brought of the entrance of the army into Moscow. Hope began to revive because it was supposed that the army would find in the Russian capital every resource it stood in need of, and that the enemy had every resource, and that it had retreated by the road of the Savary for the purpose of covering St. Petersburg, it appearing that the King of Naples, at the head of all the cavalry, had taken the road leading from Moscow to that city. The illusion was soon dispelled and made way for the most intense uneasiness. Intelligence was soon received of the burning of that immense capital and of the march from the Russian army, which had concealed its movements from our own by causing a small corps to retreat towards Moscow after the battle, whilst the main body took the road of Kaluga, Tula, and Zarayisk. It formed a junction at these places, and being thus stationed on our right flank, it found itself at a much shorter distance from Smolensk than we were, and rendered the position of Moscow untenable, especially since the event of the fire, which had destroyed all the resources we had so confidently relied on. This calamity occurred at a most unfortunate moment. The month of October and the bad season were close at hand. The inhabitants had fled, and everything presaged evil to us. On the other hand, Moscow was reduced to ashes. The defeated Russian army was recruiting itself with difficulty behind the Nara. It was natural, therefore, to expect that, stunned by such disasters, Alexander would accept of a peace. Every intelligence obtained from the interior led to this conclusion. St. Petersburg was in the greatest alarm. It was expected that the French would move upon the northern capital, and an apprehension was entertained that Kutuzov would be unable to prevent such a movement, his forces being supposed to be either paralyzed or destroyed. Preparations were made for evacuating St. Petersburg, and everything afforded an indication of the deep anxiety felt on the occasion by the government and the nation at large. There could therefore be no doubt as to the course necessary to be adopted. A retrograde movement would have raised the hopes and doubled the strength of the army. It was necessary to assume an appearance of at least self-confidence, to leave a little to chance and to profit of the terror we'd inspired in order to open a negotiation. The emperor decided upon this course, and it would no doubt have had all the success anticipated from it if the sovereign of that country, notwithstanding all his power, were not often the most dependent of men. But the murmurs of the high nobility, the threats of the English commissioners, who failed not to revive the recollection of a recent catastrophe, did not allow him to consult the best interest of his empire. He was compelled to reject overtures of the advantages of which he must, in his then condition, have been fully sensible. His generals received orders not to relax in their exertions, but to collect all the resources at their disposal. They were nevertheless as lavish of generous protestations as insensible to the ravages to which their country was a prey. They never ceased their pacific assurances and laid great stress upon the evils of war and their desire to bring them to an end. These assurances, which were repeated at the advanced posts as well as at Kutuzov's headquarters, produced the desired effect. Murat and Luriston fell into the snare and communicated their hopes to the emperor. The state of affairs gave them great plausibility. He imbibed them also and prolonged his stay in the expectation of the opening of negotiations, which never took place. These delays and a feint which was carried on under cover of the armistice, had at last the effect of explaining to him the intentions and the good faith of the Russians. The retreat commenced from that moment. Nothing could be more unexpected than the misfortunes of which it was to be the forerunner. Attempts were nevertheless already making to work upon the public opinion. The clergy could hardly disguise their sentiments on the subject of the captivity of their chief, and were incessant in their underhand endeavors to shake the affection of the country people for the emperor. It must, however, be allowed that when he embarked in that painful religious discussion, he had only sought the interests of the church, and had adopted no measure that had not been concerted with the prelacy. The documents annexed will afford proofs of this prudence and circumspection in matters of so delicate a nature. Let's see. Okay, part 2, chapter 1. Whilst our army was commencing its retreat, a scene occurred at Paris which might have been attended by disagreeable consequences. To describe correctly what passed is rendered the less difficult to me by the circumstances of my being almost the only person well acquainted with the details. It is singular that this extraordinary affair happened on the 23rd of October, the very day on which our troops evacuated Moscow. I have already said that at this time France was perfectly tranquil. In the reports which I daily addressed to the Emperor, no reason had occurred for instituting anything of an unfavorable nature. The couriers sent to the Emperor usually left Paris at 6 or 7 in the morning. I was in the habit of making up my dispatches in the morning, that is to say, of rising very early and not going to rest again after sealing my packet. The morning of the 23rd of October was the only one during the whole period of the Emperor's absence on which I had occasion to depart from this practice. I employed part of the night in writing my letters, and when I went to bed, I desired that I should not be disturbed unless some business of importance rendered it necessary to call me. I was in the habit of locking the doors of my apartments, particularly the doors of my official room and my bedroom. At 7 in the morning, I was awakened by a tumult in the apartments adjacent to that in which I slept. Being very much fatigued, I was trying to sleep in spite of the noise, when I heard the panels at the door of my office driven in and falling to the floor. The idea struck me that the house was on fire, and that I had fastened my doors. This breaking in was done on purpose to awaken me. I therefore rose hastily and groped my way in the dark to the door of my bedroom, through which the noise seemed to come. On opening the door, which led into my office, which was dark in consequence of the window shutters being still fast, I saw no light except what was let in by the fractures in the principal door. Through these fractures, I perceived a number of soldiers under arms, who were not only filled my apartments, but also the whole court of the hotel. They were breaking down the parts of the doors which continued to be held together by the bolts and fastening. I opened the door of my office and, going to them, asked what they wanted. My apartments were so crowded that I could see nobody but soldiers. Someone said, "Call the general," and I soon descried coming towards me the General Laurie, formerly chief of the staff of the Army of the Rhine under General Moreau. Laurie and I were comrades during the first campaign of the Revolution. We were on terms of intimacy, and notwithstanding the difference of our political opinions, I still retained friendship for him. On accosting me, he said, "You are arrested. You may be glad that you have fallen into my hands. At least no mischief shall befall you." I could not comprehend what this meant and what I saw about me. Laurie then said, "The Emperor was killed at Moscow on the 8th of October. "Nonsense," I replied. "I have a letter from him of that date. I can show it to you." Laurie, looking earnestly at me, observed, "Can that be? Can it be possible?" He was in a state of nervous excitement, and there was a convulsed movement of his jaw, as if he had been attacked by tetanus. He only repeated, "That cannot be possible." Finding that I could make nothing of Laurie, I addressed myself to the troops, while he went to look for a sergeant with whom he had spoken on his way to my hotel. But this sergeant, who was a worthy man, had not entered with the men who followed Laurie. He called him several times, but the sergeant had probably stopped in the court of the hotel or on the quay where the corps was posted. Perceiving Laurie so eager in seeking for this sergeant, I suspected that he was a hired assassin, more especially when I heard the general call, "Bring the sergeant whom I spoke to on the way here." I now thought only of saving myself. While Laurie was seeking the sergeant, I addressed the officer who had the command and asked who he was. He answered, "I am Captain Adjutant of the 10th Cohort of the National Guards." "Well," said I, "do those soldiers belong to your corps?" "Yes, sir," he replied. "Then," added I, turning to them, "you are not mutinous soldiers?" All the soldiers exclaimed, "No, we are with our orders. A general has brought us here." "Do you know that general?" I asked. No, was their answer. I then said, what I see astonishes me. I know the general, and I will tell you what situation he has drawn you into. He is one of General Moreau's aides de camp, and was confined in the prison of La Force, from which he ought not to have been liberated without my authority. He is a conspirator. Do you know me? They replied, no. Do you know where you are? They again replied, no. One officer said, I know you. You are the police minister. In that case, said I order you immediately to arrest General Laurie, who has brought you here. The captain adjutant, who held me by the right arm, and another officer who held me by the left, appeared to me to be frank and undesigning men, and I was the more convinced that the whole of the soldiers were misled when I remarked that they had no flints in their muskets. I said to the captain adjutant, who wore the cross of the Legion of Honor, my good sir, you are playing a bold game here and running a great risk. You are in a fair way of being shot in a quarter of an hour. If I am not, by that time the Imperial Guard will be mounted, and then woe to you. I owe it to his memory to say that he was less moved by the apprehension of danger than by the fear of acting wrong, that is to say, committing a dishonorable action. Perceiving that he wavered, I seized the moment to say to him, if you are a man of honor, do not stain yourself with a crime, and do not prevent me from saving all of you. I only ask of you to unhand me. On saying this, I raised my right arm to seize the hilt of his sword, which he was obliged to carry under his arm on account of the smallness of the apartment, which was quite filled with armed soldiers. He seemed disposed to yield, and I was on the point of getting possession of his sword when his resolution failed him. Pushing my hand down, which he seized with force, he said to me in a severe tone, no, you must go where I have been ordered to carry you. Well then, replied I, you are a lost man, and you will only have to blame yourself when this affair is ended. On saying these words, I saw from the window in front of me General Laurie hastily crossing the court of my hotel. He was coming from the street, and had with him the most atrocious-looking fellow, whom I took to be the sergeant he had been seeking. They both entered the apartment in which I was with a furious air. Laurie stepped behind the soldiers, a circumstance from which I augured him favorably, but his companion came toward me, hanging his head and seeming unwilling to look up. He held in his hand a drawn sword, which he had taken from one of the officers, but in advancing towards me, he struck violently against a piece of furniture near the door, and the blow was so painful that he was obliged to stop and rub his leg. This accident disconcerted him and damped his courage. He placed the point of his sword against my breast and asked me whether I knew him. No, said I do not know you. He replied, I am General Guidal, who was arrested by your orders at Marseille and brought to Paris. Ah, said I know that, but if my orders had been obeyed, you would now be at Marseille, whither I directed you to be sent back about a month ago. General Guidal looked as big as he could. He had no arms for my defense. But such as my presence of mind afforded, observing that he was working himself into a passion, I said, what? Are you to come here to disgrace yourself by a cowardly assassination? He replied with vehemence, no, I will not kill you, but you must go with me to the Senate. Well, said I, let us go to the Senate, but allow me to retire to dress myself first. He replied, oh no, your clothes will be brought to you. This, in fact, was done by my servants who, however, were not allowed to come near me whilst I was dressing myself, which I did as slowly as I could. One of my secretaries, formerly an officer of the chasseurs, and who had been informed of what was passing, came down into the midst of this crowd, to which he seemed disposed to expose himself rashly. I made a sign to him not to do anything, to make himself be arrested, and said to him in a loud voice, go and tell my neighbor not to be uneasy, that no harm has happened to me. He took the hint and ran to Monsieur Real, Councillor of State and head of the first ministerial department, who resided near me close to the Rue des Saints-Pères. He and Mr. Real gave a warning to the Arch-Chancellor and the Minister for the War Department. Laurie and Guidal still detained me in my hotel with a corps soldier, which consisted of 3 companies of the 10th cohort. Finally, they determined to convey me to La Force, and Guidal took upon himself the task of conducting me to that prison. Chapter 2. A post belonging to the paid guard of the city of Paris, which was stationed at my hotel, never interfered or took any notice of the disorder. This was singular enough, as it was placed there by the staff of the garrison as a guard of security. An orderly gendarme who attended in my office was absent, having gone out to deliver my dispatches to the courier. This man had no opportunity of doing either good or harm on the occasion. Nevertheless, the War Minister procured him the Cross of the Legion of Honor for the service he had performed. Whatever these services were, they certainly were not rendered to me. All that I have related occurred in less than an hour, during which period I was constantly held fast by both arms. I was, of course, in a situation in which I could use no weapon in my defense. If there had been any at my disposal, La Hourie and Guidal sent for a cabriolet. I took my seat first, leaving to Guidal. Wow. As my conductor, the seat on my left, he sent on a detachment before the cabriolet, and we drove towards La Force. We proceeded along the Quai de Lunette, and here the idea of escaping struck me. Having gently opened the door of the cabriolet, when we got near the Tour de l'Horloge, I leapt out and ran towards the Palais de Justice, where there's always a number of people early in the morning. But I had not observed that the cabriolet was followed by a party of soldiers. They immediately ran after me, crying, "Stop him! Stop him!" In Paris, nothing more is necessary to make a man be seized. Accordingly, I was soon stopped. Guidal and the soldiers then came up, took me by the arms, and conveyed me on foot to La Force. The keeper of the prison related to me what had taken place at 6 o'clock in the morning at the gates of La Force, where La Hourie and Guidal had been confined. This keeper, who was a very worthy man, requested me to say what he could do for me, and assured me that whatever might happen, he would save me. He did what he could to hasten the departure of Guidal and the soldiers who had escorted me to the prison. During the half hour I was in custody, other detachments of the same corps arrived successfully at La Force, and Monsieur Pasquier, prefect of the police, and Monsieur de Memoirs, head of the first section of my department. But they were brought no farther than the clerk's office, because as soon as the troops which filled the little street leading to La Force withdrew, my secretary and the secretary general of the ministry arrived. They had given the alarm everywhere and brought with them a carriage in which I and the prefect of the police were conveyed to my hotel. Under the arcade of the Hotel de Ville, I met the battalion which arrested me. These troops were going to the Hotel de Ville in consequence of the orders they had received, and though I sat as far back as possible in the carriage, some of them recognized me. They, however, said nothing. I arrived at my hotel at the same time as a party of the Imperial Guard, which came there to ascertain whether I had been conveyed. I found all the persons belonging to my department at their posts, and I was therefore in a condition to transact business. I had returned very quickly, so that I was enabled to make the battalion of the 10th cohort be overtaken at the Place de Grave by a detachment of the Select Gendarmerie, which had arrived first at my hotel, because these troops, being quartered at the arsenal, soon learned what was passing at La Force. Their attachment to me, as well as their sense of duty, induced them to mount without waiting for orders. This detachment brought to me all the officers of the battalion. It may be easily imagined that they were in a great consternation. I had barely been removed from my hotel when all the clerks and officers in my department arrived. It was just upon the hour at which they commenced business. They found General La Hourie in possession of my office, and the sentinels at the gate of my hotel, having said nothing about the violence which had been committed. They were quite astonished at what they saw and knew not how to account for it. La Hourie, before he thought of getting a cabriolet, had ordered my horses to be harnessed to one of my carriages to convey me to La Force. He afterwards used the carriage himself to drive to the Hotel de Ville, whither he was directed by his instructions to repair after having arrested or killed me. He had just returned when the clerks arrived, and they were soon joined by Monsieur Laborde, first adjutant of the garrison, who came from General Hulon's quarters. He was already aware of what had taken place, as will be seen by the sequel. He made my servants arrest General La Hourie, whom they bound, and placed on one of the seats in the apartment in which the scene of the morning had passed. In this situation, I found him when I got home. Laborde proceeded from my hotel to La Force with my secretary general, who brought him there to satisfy the troops in case they should have opposed my return. I sent him to the prefecture of the police to dismiss the troops which occupied it. These troops not only refused to allow Monsieur Pasquier to take possession of his office, but arrested Monsieur Laborde as soon as he presented himself. Their resistance, however, only lasted for a moment. Paris was scarcely informed of Melay's enterprise, when everything was restored to its former state and all the harm that resulted from it, was the ridicule cast on the administration of the police, at the expense of which the public is always very willing to be amused. It afforded a fine opportunity to the Parisians to avenge themselves for other little vexations of which they thought they had reason to complain, and the military administration, on its part, was not scrupulous in resorting to any means to rid itself of all share of reproach. Having considered the affair coolly, I found no reason to doubt the correctness of my impression that what had happened was preceded by no preparatory plans which had escaped me. I observed that others were everywhere on the scent to discover the traces of a conspiracy, and I let them go on in their own way. But as I was not disposed to yield any of the prerogatives of my office, in spite of every opposition, I made all the persons, both civil and military, who had been arrested either by my order or by order of the garrison staff, be brought before me. I was resolved that all the examinations respecting this singular affair should take place in my presence. I shall give a true and correct account of the investigation. Those who read it will see to what extent a state may be disturbed in a few hours by a bold conspirator who goes straight to his object, and how much a government is to be pitied when conflicting powers divide the authorities to whom the public administration is entrusted. This question lay between the Minister for the War Department, Mr. de Feltre, and me. It is for others to judge which has most courageously stated the truth, or which has endeavored to draw upon his colleague a reprimand which he dreaded for himself, though it was neither deserved by either. For no one can protect himself against an armed force which may suddenly break into his house. The sovereign himself is at the mercy of the subaltern who commands the picket of the guard at a gate of his palace. Had this enterprise been the sequel of antecedent palace transactions, which the subsequent investigation could not have failed to disclose, I might have been blamed for not detecting them before the explosion took place, and that blame would probably have been unsparingly bestowed on me. But the cleverest man in the world cannot look into a single head and see what is planning there. At most, he can only be expected to get at what is going on between two, and even there his scope for discovery is limited enough. In like manner, the war minister was not responsible for the conduct of a regiment which left its barracks with a colonel at its head. He had therefore no reason to apprehend reproach, nor to seek by falsehood and adulation to mislead the judgment of the emperor, who was in the heart of Russia when the affair occurred. Had the war minister reported the circumstances as they really happened, the emperor would perhaps have been sooner led to reflect on the danger of having an army composed as his was, and more particularly of going to so great a distance from his capital. Chapter 3. General Melet was a gentleman of Franche-Comté, descended from an ancient family. Before the Revolution, he served in the musketeers of the king's household. The part he took in the Revolution was sincere, and he professed its principles with great fervor. He was from heart and soul a Republican, and he had a head for conspiracy, similar to those of which Greek and Roman history has transmitted to us the portraits. He rose to the rank of general during the War of the Revolution, and long before the emperor ascended the throne, he had obtained a command in the interior. His mind was continually occupied with ideas of government, but he was always faithful to his political principles. It would be too long to relate here the details of a project nearly similar to the one in question, which he wished to carry into execution while the emperor was in Prussia in 1807. His scheme was then called insane, but nevertheless the minister for the police thought it his duty to arrest him. After long confinement in one of the jails, he was transferred to what is in Paris called a maison de santé. In that kind of lockup house or prison hospital, I found him on my appointment to the ministry, and in it I left him. The house is the last on the left of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, near the barrier of the throne. Melet had long been the comrade of La Hourie in the army of the Rhine, and learned that he was at La Force through other prisoners who had been removed to the same maison de santé in which he was placed. He also knew that Guidal was in La Force. With that general he had been acquainted in the time of the Directory, having met him at the house of the Directeur, Barras, who employed him on particular services. But before proceeding farther with Malay, I ought to tell by what fatality these two men were still in La Force, from which they ought to have been removed more than a fortnight before in pursuance of orders which I had given for that purpose. Guidal had been arrested at Marseille for an affair of Jacobinism and brought to Paris for examination. This was done in consequence of the representations of the magistrate of the department of the Var, where tranquility had been so far menaced that the prefect found it necessary to resort to extraordinary measures. While Guidal was in Paris, inquiries into another affair which occurred at Marseille led to the discovery of a spy system which had been established by Frenchmen at a former period on the coast of Provence for the benefit of the English admiral who cruised before Toulon. Guidal is accused of having visited the English fleet and having set his son on board of it. This espionage was carried on for a number of years without anything occurring to excite a suspicion of its existence. In consequence of what transpired on the examination of the persons arrested on this charge, application was made for the reconveyance of Guidal to Marseille in order to his being tried there, and a fortnight had elapsed since I made the necessary arrangements with the gendarmerie for his removal. The execution of my order was delayed, and consequently Guidal was still in the prison of La Force on the 23rd of October. It was the same with respect to La Hourie. Since Moreau's trial, he had concealed himself in France. The emperor had frequently reported the orders for his departure, but M. Fouché allowed him to remain in Paris. La Hourie was a native of Brittany and easily found protectors. The emperor ordered me to take measures to send him off to America, and as a preliminary step to arrest him. He was arrested accordingly. I lost no time in preparing for his departure, and he was to have been embarked at Nantes on board a vessel bound for the United States more than a fortnight before I had signed the papers necessary to authorize his removal to that port. But he remained at La Force like Guidal in consequence of the same negligence. Malay, whose mind was always occupied with his scheme for changing the government, thought he could not have a better opportunity for trying it than at the present. The remote situation of the emperor and the army seemed to smooth difficulties which environed an enterprise so hazardous, and the success of which so materially depended on a supposition. They could not be soon enough contradicted to destroy the credulity which was the leading principle of this plan. After meditating on the various means of which he might avail himself for the execution of his project, he fixed on the following. He supposed the emperor killed under the walls of Moscow on the 8th of October. He could not take any other day without incurring the risk of being contradicted by the arrival of a regular courier. The emperor being dead, he concluded that the Senate ought to be invested with the supreme authority, and he therefore resolved to address himself in the name of that body to the nation and the army. In a proclamation to the soldiers, he deplored the death of the emperor. In another, he announced the abolition of the imperial system and the restoration of the republic. He indicated the manner in which the government was to be reconstructed, described the branches into which the public authority was to be divided, and named the directors. Attached to the different documents there appeared the signatures of several senators whose names he recollected, but with whom he had ceased to have any intercourse for a great number of years. These signatures were all written by Malay, and he drew up a decree in the name of the Senate and signed by the same senators, appointing himself governor of Paris and commander of the troops of the 1st Military Division. He also drew up other decrees in the same form, which purported to promote a higher ranks all the military officers he intended to make instruments in the execution of his enterprise. General Hulin had at this time the command in Paris, and Adjutant Commandant Toussaint was the chief of his staff. Malay, by one of his decrees, continued to say as chief of the staff, raised him to the rank of brigadier general, and gave him an order for 100,000 francs on the public treasury payable at sight. Behind Malay's Maison de Santé were the barracks, which the 10th cohort of the National Guard occupied, and which also served as a depot for the 32nd Regiment of the Line. This 10th cohort was commanded by Colonel Soulier, one of the brave old officers of the Army of Italy, but unfortunately, as simple as he was brave, he had arrived but a few days before from Spain and was appointed to the command of the 10th cohort. Malay was married, and his wife lived at a considerable distance from Paris. She came frequently to town to visit him, but never saw any reason to suspect that the planning of any extraordinary enterprise occupied his mind. a Spanish priest, who was for some time confined in the same house as Mallet, having been set at liberty, took an apartment for himself in the Place Royale, and there remained with Mallet an abbe named Lafond, who had been long under arrest on some charge connected with ecclesiastical affairs. Being in company with this abbe all day long, he found it necessary to confide in him. The two young men of Lafond's acquaintance were then in Paris, and he kept up intimate communications with them, but did not disclose the plan. One, a young corporal of the Paris Guard, was a native of the same part of the country as the abbe. The other, a young Vendéan, was studying law at Paris. The latter, being of an intriguing character, became a favorite with Mallet, who, on the day before that which he selected for the execution of his project, directed him to go to the Palais Royal and purchase a 3-colored scarf. At the same time, he gave him a letter to his wife in which he directed her to put his uniform and his arms in his portmanteau, and also the uniform for an aide-de-camp, which had been left with her, probably by design, and to deliver the portmanteau and the key to the bearer. In obedience to Mallet's orders, the young Vendéan carried the portmanteau to the lodgings of the Spanish priest in the Place Royale. Next day, the 22nd, Mallet invited the corporal and the student to dine with him and the Abbé Lafond. And when the party broke up, he told the two young men to go to the Spanish priests and wait for him there. At 10 at night, after the doors were locked, Mallet and Lafond let themselves out by the window of their apartment, which was on the ground floor and adjacent to the garden. The wall at the end of the garden was not very high, and when they got over it, they were in the street. Having accomplished this without creating the least alarm, they proceeded on foot to the Spanish priest's lodging in the Place Royale. Mallet sent for punch, and when he saw that the liquor began to operate on the heads of the young men, he spoke to them of his plan as a thing long ago agreed upon between him and the Senate, but which was only to be executed in the case of the emperor's death, and of that event he had just been informed. In this way he imposed upon his two dupes, who knew him to be dissatisfied with the imperial government, but who never before had heard him hint at anything of the kind he then proposed. Mallet showed them the instructions which he said had been sent to him by the committee of the government established at the Luxembourg. His appointment as governor of Paris, a credit granted him to a considerable amount on the treasury, and finally an order for the immediate installation of new authorities in the place of those acting under the imperial government. All these documents were of his own fabrication. Without giving his auditors time for reflection, he opened his portmanteau, dressed himself in the uniform of a general officer, made the young corporal put on the aide-de-camp's uniform, and decked out the young Vendéan in the 3-colored scarf. Chapter 4. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Mallet left the Spanish priest's apartment, occupied by only the 3 persons I have already named, and proceeded to Puppencourt Barracks, where the 10 cohort was quartered. Strangers are not admitted into the barracks of Paris during night. Mallet therefore stated that he had particular business with the commanding officer. He was conducted to the unfortunate Soulier, who was then living out of his quarters. He was sick, and he was not able to rise to receive Mallet. Mallet depended for no other success of his enterprise entirely upon the trick he had to play here, and he certainly performed it dexterously. Without giving his name, he entered Soulier's bedroom. The colonel, after apologizing for not getting up, asked the general what commands he had for him. Mallet said, "I see you are not informed of what has happened. We have had the misfortune to lose the emperor." On hearing this, Soulier burst into tears. And Mallet, who affected to participate in his grief, proceeded to say, "The government has changed, and here's the order which General Mallet has this moment given me to deliver to you." Soulier read the paper. It purported to be an order signed by General Mallet, requiring the colonel to muster the cohort under arms, to notify the events which had taken place, and to follow punctually whatever directions might be given to General Lamotte, who was the bearer of the order and who had received instructions from the committee of the Senate invested with the government. Thus Mallet passed himself off to Soulier as General Lamotte. Soulier saluted the general, sent for the adjutant of his cohort, ordered him to call out the troops, and in the presence of the pretended General Lamotte, expressed his regret at not being able to accompany that officer to the barracks. Mallet then proceeded, in the character of Lenotte, to the square of the barracks where the troops were drawn up. He made the account of the emperor's death and the proclamation to the Senate, to the nation, and the army, announcing the change of the government, be read to the cohort by the light of torches. During all this scene, it never struck any individual to question the truth of the facts. But certainly nothing could be more clear than the terms in which Mallet explained everything. The pretended General Lamotte ordered out of the cohort, which was 1,200 strong, without requiring the 10,000 reserve ball cartridges, which, according to the practice of the garrison of Paris, were kept in the colonel's headquarters, or making the wooden flints be changed when the soldiers put in their muskets for exercise. Mallet marched off at the head of the cohort, leaving only a single company in the barracks to accompany Soulier to the Hôtel de Ville, where the colonel was ordered to wait for him and to make arrangements for the reception of the government committee. He did not neglect to deliver the colonel the commission by which he was raised to the rank of brigadier general, accompanied by an order on the treasury for 100,000 francs. The 23rd of October fell upon a Friday, which was parade day for the garrison of Paris. Since the emperor's absence, the parade had always taken place every day in the Place Vendôme. It was necessary for the troops of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine to leave the quarters early in order to reach the Place Vendôme in time. The appearance of the 10th cohort marching on a Friday morning with arms and baggage therefore excited no surprise. Mallet marched the cohorts through the Rue Saint-Antoine to the gate of La Force. He ordered it to be opened and made Guidal and La Hourie be brought to him. He then ordered the keeper to shut the gate and allow no other person to come out. Having embraced La Hourie and Guidal, he informed them of the emperor's death and what had taken place in consequence of that event. He then said, "There's no time to be lost. Here are your instructions. Take this court and execute them. I need only half a company to go with me to take possession of the government from Paris, where I shall expect to hear from you. We shall meet afterwards at the Hôtel de Ville." La Hourie took the story of the emperor's death for granted. All he had been in the confidence of General Moreau and knew all his projects. He also remembered the 18th Brumaire, in which he had acted a part. These ideas recurred to his mind, and aided by the appearance of Mallet in his embroidered uniform and followed by regular corps, left no room for suspicion. He read the orders, which seemed to come in an official form to him, and took the command of the cohort, leaving only 50 men with Mallet, who hastened to take possession of the prefecture of police. Mallet found M. Pasquier, who was in the habit of rising early, already at his post. He arrested him and installed the Vendéan student and the Abbé Lafond in his office. Notwithstanding the situation in which the prefect of the police was placed, he found means to send one of his clerks to me to inform me of what was going on. This clerk, however, when he came to my hotel, merely insisted upon seeing me immediately and said not a word more to anyone. As he was known to the port of the hotel, he might, as a preliminary step, have made the gate to be shut. This he did not do, and he was informed of the order I had left when I went to bed at 5 a.m. that I was not to be called except for business of importance. As he came on foot, he was not long at my hotel before General La Hourie, who appeared to have followed close at his heels, and entered like a shot, as I have already related. La Hourie dispatched General Guidal, who had accompanied him, to arrest the Minister of War, but as a sergeant who was to have assassinated me had not kept his word, he ran on after Guidal, whom he overtook in the Rue de Saint-Père, and brought him back to my hotel with his detachment. It was solely owing to this incident that the war minister missed having an adventure similar to mine. On parting with La Hourie at the gate of La Force, Mallet sent by soldiers of the 10th cohort packets to the commanding officers of 2 regiments of the Parisian paid guard. These packets contained the same proclamations which had been read to the cohort when he called it out, and besides minutes, instructions as to the duty required of the 2 regiments. He ordered 1 regiment to close all the barriers of Paris and to allow no person to pass through them. This was done so that in all the neighboring towns from which assistance in case of need might have been obtained, nothing was known of the transactions in Paris. He sent the other regiment to occupy the bank, the treasury, and different ministerial offices, all the treasury. Some resistance was made, The minister of that department was on the spot, and he employed the guard of his household in maintaining his authority. But in the whole of the 2 regiments of the Paris Guard, not a single objection was started to the execution of Malet's orders. While Malet was thus acting through the agency of others on different points, he proceeded himself along the Rue Saint-Honoré with a party of troops he had reserved for himself. He turned the corner of the street which leads to the Place Vendôme. Here he detached from his troop an officer with 25 men, whom he ordered to form in order of battle in front of the office of the staff, which was the house in the angle of the Place Vendôme on the left, and to allow no person to come out. He gave the officer a packet to be delivered to Adjutant General Doucet. The packet contained the documents already described, namely the proclamation announcing the death of the emperor, the decree of the Senate, Malet's appointment to the office of governor of Paris, and a brigadier general's commission with an order for 100,000 francs to Doucet. To this packet were added instructions, the form of a confidential letter, in which Malet expressed great satisfaction at the connection with their relative duties in the public service would now establish between them. He desired Doucet to transmit certain orders to the troops at Saint-Denis, Saint-Germain, and Versailles, and also to those in Paris. Of the last, he only accepted the paid guard, which he had already employed, and the 10th cohort, to which he had assigned the task of arresting the prefect and the minister of police, and also General Hulin. He added that, being aware of the intimate relation subsisting between them and General Hulin, he wished to relieve him from the disagreeable duty of arresting him, and would take that business on himself. At the same time, he warned Doucet to take care that no opposition was made to the arrest, and desired him to be detained in front of his office until further orders. A picket commanded by the officer who was the bearer of the packet. Adjutant General Doucet was in bed when the officer arrived. As the officer refused to communicate with any third person, he was introduced into the bedroom of the Adjutant General, who, suddenly aroused from his slumber, was quite at a loss what to think of the dispatch presented to him. He read the documents several times and asked the officer of the 10th cohort who brought them what had occurred in his barracks. The young man related all that he knew, and he had seen his corps called out under arms, had followed Malet to La Force, had seen La Hourie and Guidel brought out, and had continued on with the rest of the cohort to the Place Vendôme, whence Malet proceeded to General Hulin, with whom he then was 4. Added the officer. I can see your detachment in front of General Hulin's quarters. And in fact, it was easy to see the party from the window of Monsieur Doucet's room. It was impossible for Doucet to doubt the existence of an enterprise, the details of which Malet had communicated to him in his instructions. The project, it was true, might be called absurd, but it was acted upon. Of this he could not fail to be assured, both by what he saw and by what the young officer, who was himself one of the agents, told him. Nevertheless, he not only did not stir a step to counteract what was going on, but he completely lost his self-possession and became alarmed about his responsibility. Malet had ordered him to arrest Monsieur Laborde, whose activity he doubtless dreaded. Doucet sent for Monsieur Laborde, who had apartments in the same hotel. They were reading the papers together, when Malet, returning from General Hulin's quarters, entered the room in which they were. He asked Doucet why Laborde was not under arrest, and ordered him to surrender himself. Laborde resisted, as some discussion arose, which terminated by his leaving the room, saying, "In order to place myself under arrest, I must go hence, for this is not my apartment." Going downstairs, he observed the Inspector General of the Police, who had come to the office of the garrison staff in quest of information. The picket of the 10th cohort, stationed at the door in pursuance of the orders which had been given by Malet, refused him admittance. But Laborde called from the stairs to let him pass. The soldiers, who knew Laborde's person and had long been accustomed to obey him, readily complied. Laborde told the Inspector General what was going on and conducted him to Doucet's apartment, where Malet still was. In a moment, the scene changed. Malet could no longer maintain his deception in the presence of the inspector, who, addressing him in a loud tone, said, "Monsieur Malet, you had no authority to leave the house where you were detained without my permission." Then turning to Adjutant General Doucet, he added, "There is something under all this. Arrest him in the first place while I go to the ministry and get an explanation of the business." Mallet stood with his back against the fireplace of the room. Finding that all was lost, he grasped a pistol, which he had in his coat pocket. The other three saw the motion he made reflected in the opposite glass, and they immediately seized him and disarmed him. What had happened to General Uhlans, whither Mallet had been before he came to Doucet, was learned after his arrest. Mallet, who was accompanied by a captain of the 10th cohort, asked to speak to General Uhlans in private. The general came out of his official cabinet to receive him. Mallet said he had disagreeable commission to execute, as he was ordered by the minister of the police to arrest him and put the seals on his papers. General Uhlans demanded to see the order, upon which Mallet said, "Let us go into your cabinet, and I will show it to you." Uhlans went first. Mallet, accompanied by a captain of the cohort, followed with his hand on a pistol which was in his pocket. At the moment Uhlans turned round to see the order, Mallet fired the pistol in his face, and he instantly fell. The general was not killed, but the ball which entered by his cheek remained in his head and could not be extracted. Mallet then turned around and proceeded to Adjutant General Doucet's without the captain, who witnessed this transaction and had become an accomplice in it, seemed to think it was extraordinary. Chapter 5. General Mallet being arrested. All was at an end. We can now proceed to those personal identifications which, at the close of the examinations, were necessary for placing the affair at a clear point of view. So many various opinions prevailed respecting the party of which Mallet was said to be the only agent, that I felt a sort of pride in setting them right, being well convinced that it was always best to come at the truth, however disadvantageous it might be, and that nothing is so dangerous as to yield to illusion or to be misled by passion. On this occasion, some misunderstanding arose between the Minister of War and myself. He suspected me of hostility to him and to the army, and lent an ear to a multitude of stories to which he ought never to have listened, and which induced him to behave to me in the way in which he supposed me capable of behaving to him. But I did not retort his conduct upon him, and therefore he remained master of the field. He sought to make himself of consequence in this affair, and by attaching importance to improbabilities, he arrested indiscriminately various individuals whom he sought to implicate in Mallet's conspiracy. I, on the contrary, separated from the affair all who were not absolutely included in it. The Minister of War made it a great subject of complaint against me that I defended the innocence of General Lamotte, whom he had arrested on the ground that he was the accomplice of Mallet, and that it was he who had taken the 10th cohort from its quarters. He would not believe that Mallet had assumed the name and acted the part of Lamotte. I was obliged, after the declaration of Colonel Soulier, to bring it into my closet the real General Lamotte, who was not yet known to the colonel. Soon after, I caused General Mallet to be brought in, and he immediately recognized him as the individual who had come to him in the morning at his quarters, where he had presented himself under the name of General Lamotte. After this proof of the identity of General Mallet and General Lamotte, the Minister of War asserted that there must have been some connivance between General Mallet and Colonel Soulier, who commanded the 10th cohort, as otherwise he would not have chosen that cohort in preference to any other troop. These were two unfounded ideas. That there was no connivance between Mallet and Soulier is evident from the circumstances of the former assumed the name of Lamotte to introduce him to the latter. Why should he have done this had there been a previous understanding between them? As to Mallet's choice of the 10th cohort, he fixed upon that because it was so situated as to be beyond the observation of the authorities, who were to be feared. The Faubourg Saint-Antoine was a considerable distance from the Place Vendôme and the office of the Minister of the War Department. But if he had not taken the 10th cohort, he could have found no other except in the Rue Verte or the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. That is to say, under the very eyes of the staff officers of the garrison, who would have been alarmed before the cohort could have reached La Force, the prefecture of police, and the office of minister. In spite of the reasonableness of these observations, they were not attended to, and passion predominated. Through this madness of Malay, 14 unfortunate men were condemned to death by an extraordinary court-martial. They were guilty, no doubt, but in justice it must be mentioned that they were most deeply distressed at the idea of being supposed capable of knowingly cooperating in the proceedings into which they were led by Malay. They said that if the emperor had been there, they would not all have perished. They were right, and I believe that had the emperor been in Paris, all would have been pardoned, with the exception of Malay, La Hourie, and Guidel. He never would have suffered an execution like that which took place. I used my influence as far as possible to repel the idea that the senators had the least share in furnishing the documents which Malay declared he had procured from them. But for the accident through which he failed in arresting the Minister of War, and which immediately restored me to my functions, General Malay would have been master of many things in a few moments, and in the contrary of the country, which is extremely susceptible to the contagion of example, he would have got possession of the treasury, which was at that time very rich, the post and the telegraph, and there were 100 cohorts of the National Guards in France. He would have learned by the arrival of estafettes from the army the melancholy situation of which the officers then were, and there would have been nothing to prevent him seizing the emperor himself if he arrived alone, or of marching to meet him if he came attended. But Malay could not have long sustained the character of the second Cromwell, for the deception would have been discovered, and France was tired of convulsions. Probably he would soon have been left unassisted to complete the execution of his project. However, the danger which threatened the public tranquility was great, and we were forced to confess, in spite of ourselves, that there was a weak point in our situation where it was hitherto supposed to be most firmly established. The most remarkable circumstance connected with this affair was the case with which the troops were persuaded of the emperor's death, while not one of their officers sought to ascertain the fact or even to bestow a thought on his son. These same soldiers, without any ceremony, turned against individuals in power and saw their general, the commandant of Paris, killed without making any effort to defend him. These were painful reflections, and without any wish to cherish illusions. It was impossible not to think of the calamities which all this was calculated to bring about. The prefect of the department of Paris was in the country when the colonel of the 10th cohort, Soulier, arrived at the Hôtel de Ville. There he announced the death of the emperor and stated that he had come to take possession of the apartment selected for the government committee, which was coming to the Hôtel de Ville. A clerk of the prefecture immediately sent to the prefect the messenger, who was dispatched with the express, met him in the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Antoine. He had just returned to town and knew nothing of what had taken place. The messenger delivered the note from the clerk of the prefecture, who urged the prefect to return to the utmost dispatch. The note concluded with the words, "Fui Imperator." The prefect hastened to the Hôtel de Ville, which he found occupied by Soulier, who produced all the documents in virtue of which he was acting, and stated that the minister of the police, who had just gone, had recommended that speedy arrangements should be made for the reception of the government committee. The prefect at first supposed that I was the person alluded to and was at a loss to understand what was going on. He ordered his horses, intending to go to the arch-chancellor, and he said to the people about him, "Do as these gentlemen order you." But before his carriage drew up, the farce had ended. Colonel Soulier and all who accompanied him were arrested while executing the orders of Malay. It was made a serious charge against the prefect of the Seine that he should have said to the people, "Do as these gentlemen order you," and the emperor was prevailed upon to dismiss him. The influence of the military authority was exerted against him, and he was disgraced. But after all, what could the prefect do against a colonel and his troop? Even supposing that his orders to his servants had been the reverse of what they were.